I'm Vinnie Politan. Thanks so much for joining us here tonight on Closing Arguments. And all of you have been watching this gavel-to-gavel coverage out of Wisconsin involving a really difficult case for prosecutors. Not an easy one. We know Victoria Prokopovitz disappeared. Her body has never been found. And prosecutors are trying to prove a murder case against her husband. So today, another big day inside the courtroom. The lead investigator on the witness stand. Let's bring in Court TV legal correspondent Chanley Painter, who joins us tonight from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Chanley, great to see you. A confidential informant took the stand today. Prosecutors need every piece of evidence they can get in this case. Tell us about what the informant had to say.
Well, Vinny, I'm going to give you a play-by-play because our cameras weren't allowed to record or even get audio of this informant. And I have to say precautions were put in place to protect his identity even before the jury entered the courtroom. He was escorted in with a couple of investigators, detectives, walking him into the courtroom. He took a seat at the witness counsel table, and the judge had him write down his name. The attorneys agreed to it, put it in an envelope, and sealed it away, gave it to the clerk so no one would know this witness's identity. But once the jury entered, he began to testify. On direct examination, he told the jury that Jim Prokopovitz, while they were both incarcerated in 2019 in the Brown County Jail, told him that Jim knew Victoria was dead and that her body would never be found. Now, this witness testified that he thought that was pretty disturbing for an inmate to say. He also went on to tell the jury that Jim wrote down his girlfriend's phone number on a slip of paper and gave it to this informant, hoping that he would call and communicate to Kathy Friday, the alleged mistress in this case. That slip of paper was introduced into evidence. We learned that this informant never actually tried to contact Kathy Friday. There was no contact order between her and Jim Prokopovitz at the time. But then on cross-examination, the defense may have scored some points in bringing about a little bit of uncertainty as far as the statements that Jim told the informant. So on cross-examination, the defense clarified that Jim never stated that he killed Victoria. Also, the defense also pointed out that these comments that Jim Prokopovitz made were more than 6 years after his wife Victoria disappeared, and the defense asked the witness, isn't it safe to assume that after about 6 years or so that he would assume that his wife is dead and that it wasn't so certain that he knew 100% that she was dead? And the witness agreed with him, Vinnie. So then on redirect, the prosecutor had one question, and she said, but he also said that they would never find her body, right? And the witness said, correct. Then we have recross. One last question, and the defense said, but the authorities never found her body in those 6 years. So was it more of the conversation that he assumed, since the authorities hadn't found her body, that her body would never be found? And the witness agreed with that. So it seems as though there was a little bit of competing of certainty, and well, he was just assuming, since it had been so long, that his wife's body would never be found. But I have to mention that the defendant during this time back and forth was vigorously whispering to his defense counsel because he knew this was an important witness and he wanted his defense to make sure that these statements weren't certain.
Now, did this informant get any sort of a deal? Was there anything in it for this informant to testify?
Yeah, that was one of the questions the prosecutor asked the informant on direct was, are you being promised anything to show up here to testify? You know, those typical kind of questions that we hear from confidential informants. And he said that he wasn't hoping for anything, that he was just doing the right thing. That was the quote. He was just doing the right thing. Of course, on cross-examination, the defense has to bring that up again and says, well, at the time you came forward, your criminal matter, whatever that was pending, was more pressing. You were wanting help back then, but as of now, you know, a year and a half later, it's not so pressing, so you really don't care if you get any help, right? And he, of course, denied that.
All right. You know, again, another witness in this case where prosecutors, I think, needed a little bit more to get out of him. Okay, let's talk about the lead investigator in the case. Let's take a listen to some of his testimony from today.
So your agency had some preliminary information from Mr. Prokopovitz?
Yes.
Is this the first time now that two officers are making contact with him about what would have happened when his wife went missing?
No.
Okay. This is the second time?
So first responding officers would have made contact with Mr. Prokopovitz and obtained preliminary information and began search efforts. This would be the first time two detectives are making contact with Mr. Prokopovitz.
Okay. So the first time that you're starting to talk to him about what's occurred?
Yes.
And again, at the time that you're arriving, the information is that you're just looking for someone at that time.
Yes, that's our primary focus at that point in time.
And who is that person identified as?
The person's identified as Victoria Prokopovitz,
And what was her relationship to Mr. Prokopovitz?
his wife.
Would you agree that people do have different demeanors when they suffer traumatic events?
Of course, and based on my training experience, I recognize that. And I also recognize that the importance of getting a baseline when meeting with someone.
So with respect to you being aware of that in the course of your training and your experience in law enforcement, you're not there to judge anybody's demeanor, is that right?
I'm not. I'm just being observant because I understand that the keys and the details.
Okay. But a demeanor of an individual can be concerning or noteworthy if it's not something that's urgent. Would you agree?
Yes, I would.
Is it more important as well to be looking at the content of what somebody's telling you?
Content and context, especially when you're also viewing that in comparison with others that are involved in the same incident. I take all that into consideration, and then I take that into consideration with the overall investigation.
All right, Chandler, let me ask you, were there any observations of the demeanor of Jim Prokopovitz by this lead investigator that were noteworthy?
Well, yeah, they were clear to see on the second recording. It's a video recording when the defendant went to the Brown County Jail in July of 2013, about 3 months after his wife disappeared. And we actually see him sitting there talking to the detectives. And the tenor of that interview is quite different from the first recording they played, where the detectives are pointing the finger, being accusatory, and he's being defensive and agitated. They're trying to call him out on his delay in calling police after his wife went missing, why he went ahead and went to work on the day his wife went missing, why he didn't participate in any of the searches immediately after and months after his wife went missing. And through it all, as what we could hear, because the audio was difficult to understand inside the courtroom, he stuck to his story that he didn't know what happened to his wife, Victoria.
So in the recorded interview, no confession.
There is no confession. Again, it was hard to hear, but every time something important would happen, the prosecutor would stop the audio to reinforce it with the detective. And I'm sure if there was a confession, she would have emphasized that with the lead detective through a questioning. But just to note, the speakers for the recordings, there were 2 played today, were the speaker's right next to the jury box. So the jury didn't indicate any difficulty in hearing the recording or understanding what was being said. In fact, they took vigorous notes throughout both of the recordings that were played today, even though in the gallery it seemed a bit echoey and we really couldn't understand most of it.
Gotcha. All right, one more important witness today, who is the psychiatrist who was treating Victoria Prokopovitz. Let's listen to some of that testimony.
So then approximately you would have seen and been Victoria's psychiatrist for about 5 years?
That's right.
Okay. When you would meet with Victoria, would you meet with her one-on-one?
That's right.
Were there times when other individuals were in your counseling sessions?
I cannot remember that.
Okay. From what you remember, again, this is some time ago, it was mostly you seeing Victoria alone?
Yes.
Okay. And you, I guess in the course of your treatment, what were your, impressions of Victoria?
Well, the information I'm going to say right now is basically based on refreshed memories from reading the records. I personally have a very fragmented memory of that. So the memories that I see here recorded is Victoria is a vulnerable person who has struggled during her childhood with multiple traumas, and which has lasted with her for a long time until I saw her and affected her significantly. She also struggled with mental illness and profoundly with the anxiety problem, and the other ones included tension and a mood disorder.
And doctor, we noted, I guess, a few specific counseling dates, and we talked about the findings or your conclusions with respect to any suicidal ideation she may have had on a given date. Based upon your recollection and your review of the records, it's your testimony that you never thought of Victoria as a suicidal person?
I never thought of her as an immediate suicide risk. I never really thought of that at all.
Okay.
The only problem with that, Chanley, right, is that she did attempt suicide in the past, didn't she?
She did, and the testimony has shown at least 2 confirmed attempts, one in the 1980s with an automobile in her garage. Her children found her. The second one, her son testified that he found her in 2008, overdose with pills. And the doctor was asked about that, direct and cross, because he treated her from 2007 all the way to 2013 until she disappeared. And he said that he didn't have any information about an overdose in his, I guess, notes or records that he had before them, but he said that she seemed, in his professional opinion, to do things like that for attention, because really, he said her issue wasn't these suicidal ideations, it was that she didn't feel supported or getting the empathy from her husband, from her family. She felt isolated, and she was frustrated in that, frustrated with her husband being controlling and abusive, and was, because of the trauma she had suffered in her childhood, she always felt, she was always looking out for someone to do her wrong, he said. And those were the reasons why she maybe acted out with this overdose. He didn't really call it an overdose. He thought it maybe had been Benadryl, but her son assumed it was because the pills were out and the bottles were out. So that was interesting testimony today. Really, both sides scored some points with the doctor's testimony.
Yeah, and the part, though, that I didn't like as a prosecutor is my witness saying I have a fragmented memory of this person. And that's not 1,000% helpful. It's honest, and you have to be honest, and I appreciate that. But, as a prosecutor trying to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt, it becomes problematic. So what was the overall takeaway? Like, what's the impression so far from all these witnesses who have testified about the woman who can't testify, Victoria Prokopovitz, the woman who's been missing? What's the picture that jurors are getting of who she was, what she was about, and where she was in her life?
Clearly, they're getting a picture that she was a woman that had issues, not only mental health issues that her children testified to, her doctor testified to, but also physical health issues. We have testimony about her cancer diagnosis and how she had to walk around with a cane, all of that. So she was struggling a lot in her life with her mental, physical health, but also with a husband who really wasn't supportive, and telling her doctor, he was abusive, controlling, and just not a very happy lifestyle. And we hear that from the defense opening statement that, this family was a family, but it wasn't a happy family. It wasn't the classic fairy tale story that we want to hear. We're going to have to face that, basically, is what he said in the opening statement. And I think that's the impression that's really coming across step by step through all of these witnesses, people who knew her the best, her son who lived with her. And I'm just wondering, are we going to hear from her husband in defense who lived with her and knew her well, too? So I think that picture is very clear in the courtroom.
Yeah, extremely sad and tragic at the same time. I mean, terrible, terrible. I feel so bad for Victoria, what she was going through. All right, so today we're back on schedule. What's in store for tomorrow?
Well, we're expecting a jam-packed day of witnesses for the prosecution, trying to make up time after the 2-day delay last week. So we're going to, like the prosecutor said at the end of the day, she's going to rush through a lot of witnesses, key testimony. She says she may even rest the case Wednesday. The defense said it would be ready to call witnesses as early as Thursday, Vinnie. But tomorrow, be on the lookout for another confidential informant from the jail who spoke to the defendant. Also be on the lookout for the defendant's ex-wife, for the prosecution to continue this narrative of him being an abusive, controlling husband. We're expecting to hear from his ex-wife and his daughter along that line of testimony. So still a lot more to go for the prosecution case, but they're trying to get it back on track after 2 days off.
All right, jailhouse informants and ex-wives, that's tough, but prosecutors need everything that they can get in this case. Janley Painter, live in Green Bay tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vinnie.